is James Gladstone? Who is this guy? He's all over my social media feed. Now he's the youngest GM in the NFL at 34 years old. The Jags said, all right, it's your time to run our franchise. He almost looks like he's a fifth-year senior kicker getting his combine invite. But no, he is responsible for running an NFL organization. And I'm sitting there saying, 34 years old, man, I just turned 30. And this dude's been given the keys to the car to run the Jags franchise. I got to dive into his story. And it's cool because he does not have a traditional scouting player personnel background. No, he got his shot because Les Snead, his old boss, current GM for the Rams, Gladstone coached his son in high school. That was his foot in the door. And then you blink and only a few years later, he's now the GM for the Jags. So I was intrigued. I had to dive in. I'm impressed with his story. In this video, we'll find out who James Gladstone is, but more importantly, why the Jags hired him. My first reaction when this all went down is, why did it take so long? January 6th, Jags dismiss head coach Doug Peterson following the 4-13 season. 2 weeks later, GM Trent Baalke at the time was fired. The reports were that they were having a hard time presenting themselves to head coaching candidates with Baalke as the GM, so he's fired. 2 days later, Liam Cohen announces the head coach, and we all remember the drama around Cohen being offered the highest paid OC position for the Bucs, or I guess the extension with the Bucs, reportedly accepting that. Wait, no, a sec, I'm gonna go be the head coach at the Jags. The fact that the GM was hired 2 days earlier, 48 hours later, Liam Cohen's the head coach, you have to think that that was a significant factor there. Also significant, Liam Cohen was the Rams OC in 2022, James Gladstone obviously coming from the Rams. The Jags were restructuring their leadership and had to find both the head coach and the GM. Initially, I'm thinking find the GM first, and then the GM can help set the standard or set the trajectory for where you want to go with the head coaching decision. The Jags, I think, looked at the market and said, there aren't that many quality head coaching candidates. I think that's why when Liam Cohen announced he was going back to the Bucs, they were like, oh crap, we gotta get on our stuff. We gotta incentivize this guy to want to come be our head coach. And that's why, in my opinion, they went the inverse route, head coach first and then GM. And it obviously was an attractive recruiting pitch to Cohen saying, you can have your say in who this GM is going to be. At that point, once you have your head coach on January 24th, took him another month, not as much of a rush, to ultimately hire James Gladstone on February 21st. So what's this guy's story? I made the joke that he looked like a kicker at the combine, but he did play receiver in college. 2013 was a teacher and high school football coach. 2016, that's where he makes the jump to be a senior assistant to the general manager, Les Snead, with the Rams. If you're hearing that and saying, Max, that seems like a huge jump. It is. The way he made that happen is he coached Les Snead's son in high school. I would love to be a fly on the wall for the conversation where he says, hey, Les, you ever need an assistant? Would love to take a crack at the National Football League. And Les is sitting there saying, you're probably the 70th person that's asked me that this week. Oh, sure. You've treated my son right. I'll give you a shot. Probably a good combo there. But right away, I mean, Gladstone's rise within the Rams was different than most GMs. Most GMs go through the talent evaluation side, the scouting side. They're an area scout, then they oversee scouting. And then by that time, it's, hey, the next jump is to go the GM route. Most scouts get into scouting to ultimately become a GM is maybe another way to word that. That was not Gladstone's route. He was more through the scouting strategy and analytics. How can I innovate in this process, and more the team building philosophies rather than the strictly player eval process. And it's cool to hear about an outlier because obviously Howie Roseman is the most popular GM in the NFL right now. When he was hired, it was kind of like, who's this outsider guy, right? He had like a legal background, more of an analytics guy. Gladstone, maybe he looks at Howie Roseman as like, Howie Roseman walked so I could run. Then 2018 gets promoted to the senior assistant to the general manager and the player personnel coordinator. Okay, this is where his story becomes really interesting to me as I dove in. 2019 becomes the director of scouting strategy. If you're hearing that and saying, Max, that just sounds like a buzz term, I would agree with you until I dove in, and I got an example for you. So I didn't realize how innovative the Rams are in their undrafted free agency process. And I once upon a time was an undrafted free agent. I can remember after the draft finishes getting 5 calls, 6 calls, got invited to half dozen mini camps. My story was different because I was getting through an injury, so I couldn't do the mini camp route. I had the player perspective of that process, but I've never really truly understood the behind the scenes and how that works. We all kind of know like the draft process specifically, but the undrafted free agency where draft ends and you have a ton of spots to still fill for rookie mini camp. And we hear every year about how an undrafted free agent makes the team, becomes an impact player, but the money side in terms of of how do teams allocate that money, I didn't really know. And so it was fun to dive into it. There was a big New York Times piece in 2023, but basically Gladstone oversaw this, what they're calling their tier 4 board for the Rams. Tier 4 being undrafted free agents. And it was cool to see how they divvied it up. So they created committees within their organization. Each committee was responsible for is responsible for a certain position group. That committee is made up of, from how I understand it, a position coach, an area scout in some level, and then some more front office, higher level person. I don't know exactly how they dial it up, but some sort of assistant to the GM type of person. And throughout the draft process, they will divvy up into silos or committees here to then take and evaluate a certain position. So linebackers, there's 100 candidates of what could be undrafted free agents. They narrow that down to a list of 30 or 40. With undrafted free agents, there's a recruiting element to that, because if I don't get drafted, I'm a linebacker. I'm thinking about the Rams, Eagles, and Seahawks. There's going to be trade-offs to all of them. So there's a certain element of guaranteed money, one, but two, the recruiting side as well. These committees are responsible for, hey, you have 400 grand in guaranteed money that you can give to the linebacker pool. So hey, committee, you need to go decide how you want to divvy that up. It was also cool. They talked about a less fund. So if Les Snead had a high ranked player that fell in the draft and went undrafted, there was a separate fund of guaranteed money that they could allocate to that player, knowing that Les Snead, the GM, liked that player. We got to go get him. But this is unique because some NFL teams, how I understand it, do it by area. Hence why you have an area scout. So there's a Southern California pool. There might be a Pacific Northwest pool. There might be the SEC, and the Southeast probably has multiple pools, but it's more area specific rather than position specific, or how the Rams do it, committee specific. And they talked about how it almost makes each committee, the leader of each committee, who then ultimately reports to Gladstone. So Gladstone's overseeing this whole process. Each committee is almost serves as like their own GM, their own scouting department is how it's somewhat structured. And then another way where the Rams are unique is they'll send out their special teams coordinator to tier 4 prospects. Again, these undrafted free agent prospects that they like, they'll send out the special teams coordinator to the school to meet, ideally in person with the coach for sure, or even the player, knowing that, and I hadn't thought about this, that a tier 4, an undrafted free agent's route to making the team is through special teams. So it's great if you're got running back film and you look great as a running back, but can you go down and cover a punt? Can you be on punt return team? Do you have the attitude and the ability to do that? In April of the draft process, they send out the special teams coordinator there, again, to then try to filter this whole list down to have a list of tier 4 prospects that they are going after and honing in on day 3 of the draft. Looking through that whole process, James Gladstone oversaw that whole entire process. And it's cool seeing the nuances and where, hey, I'm making this decision, which goes against what maybe other NFL teams do. Here's why I'm doing it. Here's maybe why it's more cutting edge. And here's why the Rams historically have been really good at not only drafting, but just finding diamonds in the rough. And then fast forward 2 years, 2021, he becomes the director of scouting. Let's put his age into context. 34 years old, youngest active GM in the NFL, the 4th youngest to ever be hired in the NFL. There's some intriguing names on this list too. Jim Irsay, 24 years old. The famous Indianapolis Colts GM was hired fresh out of college. Crazy. Second youngest, Andrew Berry at 32, the current GM for the Browns. His name was, and his face was also all over the combine, having his hands full with the Myles Garrett situation, which is not a fun spot to be in. And then Howie Roseman, who I referenced earlier, was promoted to the GM of the Eagles in 2010 at 34 years old. There are currently 4 GMs in the NFL that are under 40. And then random little nugget, the average active GM age is 46 and a half. Little side note, Jerry Jones is 82. Outlier there. So if you're a Jags fan watching this, or just a NFL fan curious about front office dynamics, so what's his process going to be? You know, he's hired. What makes him so much more unique than the next guy? And I mentioned the undrafted free agent tier system. That's nice, Max, but you're going to win Super Bowls by how you draft in the first few rounds, not how you're doing an undrafted free agency, which is true. And the reality is, when I was watching those interviews at the combine, they all kind of say the same things, right? The process is, oh, we're going to be a team that builds through the draft and we're going to supplement through free agency, which everyone's going to say that. It's not necessarily groundbreaking. There's a lot of buzz terms and whatnot, but there are a couple things that did stick out to me from his combine interviews that I do think are unique, and it'll be interesting to track. First one is he drove home the point of intangibles. He said top of mind is intangibles before, hey, height, weight, how fast they run. Okay, that's all great, but intangibles first, which I like. I think that makes sense. I think we can get lost, especially when you are a GM. You can get lost in how do they look in shorts and a t-shirt. And it's easier to go draft the guy that looks better on paper than it is to go draft the intangible guy, because you're going to get criticism when you draft the guy who doesn't look as good on paper, but it's like, man, trust me, I just got a gut feeling, versus you're not going to get criticized in the short term if you take the guy that looks like a Greek god and it's like, oh, sweet, well, we got to go get this guy. And that's where I think it'll be interesting as we track his career, where his age is a strength in that I think he's going to be more modern. He's going to be, I think there's a willingness to get in the weeds that if you're a 56-year-old lifelong scout, sure, you're a grinder. I'm not saying you're not, but just naturally, just like in any industry, you might not be willing to carve out a unique path or a different path or embrace up and coming technologies and whatnot, which Gladstone has. But it's one thing to do that, but then you're going against the grain and you have to stay firm and say, no, I believe this is how we need to go about things. And the same thing comes through with, hey, taking the guy that has intangibles, getting criticism in the short term, getting criticism from guys like me and Mel Kiper saying, why are you drafting this guy? But sticking to your guns. He's getting hired because he's different. I think he needs to lean into that. And it will be fascinating this year to see how it goes out, or this draft year, because he's wasting no time with a lot of ammunition. The Jags have 10 picks this year, a pick in each round, 2 in the 4th round and 2 in the 6th round. This is a roster that underperformed last year. And that's the last little nugget I'll talk about too. He made reference to how this Jags roster was similar to how the 2017 Rams roster was, in that the Rams were coming off a 4-win season, hired a new head coach, up and coming guy, younger guy, and the Rams have been one of the most steady NFL franchises to date. I'm interested to track this guy. The NFL has the lowest average GM tenure at just 2.1 years, which is the lowest of all major sports. He's got to have a big time draft now this year in a couple months, but he's been part of some great drafts, most recently just the Rams this past year. We're doing football deep dives every single day, so if you like this video, be sure to like it, give me a comment down below with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel to not miss any future content. Thanks, guys.